I now introduce you to Angela O'Donovan, who is the chairperson of Bantry Historical Society. She is very passionate about what she does, and she's here to talk about growing up in an Irish rural farm in Bantry. And I pass you over now to Angela.
Thanks, Aidan. As Aidan said, yeah, my name is Angela. I grew up in a small town land, Gorybeg, 2 miles outside of Bantry, on the way to Ballylicky. I spent a lot of time looking out at Bantry Bay and admiring the nature of the area. And being in a small farm, I was born in 1950, so it was a different era. Sometimes when I look back, and being in the Bantry Historical Society makes me look back and reflect on what we had then. And I can't help marvelling at the wonders of life back then, as look at my childhood and look at the childhood of the children of today, or even of 20 years ago. Life has changed so much. In my time, as far as I'm aware, and I'm pretty confident of this, from the time I was born to the time I started school, I left home once for half a day because my granduncle had died in the Gaelic Valley. And I remember that was my first time seeing a dead person, and I kept staring at him. And I remember my sister and we were given these round things that we could eat. They were totally strange objects to us. I learned they're called Marietta Biscuits. I had never seen them until then, and I enjoyed them, and I still enjoy them. But back on the farm, we had a small farm of about 8 cows, milking cows, and of course milking cows would always be more placid, especially being milked by hand. And because we had so few, but it was typical of the time, we almost had a personal rapport with each animal. There was some calves, and we would feed the calves, and it was very satisfying to see the calf wagging his tail or her tail as they were drinking their bucket of milk or feed. And the cows, I was always very fond of the cows, and cows were treated, and all animals were treated much more humanely, I suppose, then than now. There was no milking machine in our farm. The more modern farmers began to have milking machines, all right. And I can remember going out in the morning to bring in the cows. In the summertime, the cows would be out day and night in the summer, out by day in the winter. But this would be maybe autumn time, when cows would be producing less milk, so there wouldn't be any urgency on them to get milked, because they wouldn't be bursting with milk, so to speak. They would be still lying down in the field after their night's sleep, and I'd be sent out to bring them in for the morning milking. And you know, in the autumn, the ground is getting cold, the atmosphere is a bit cooler, and I'd probably be on barefooted at the time. And I used to love rousing the cow from her resting place and lying on the warm patch. It would be heated from the body of the cow overnight. I just loved that, and then I might move on to a second cow and enjoy a moment of bliss in the warmth of the ground there, but then usher them all home and that. And I seem to have a draw for the cows, because when my father and mother would be milking by hand, they'd sit on a little stool under the cow and milk away. My mother would wear a apron, as she called it, made from sacking, of Hessian, material. That would have come around the bag of ration or the bag of yellow meal or something. And I would be often inside in the stall. That's the house where the cows were held. They had a little cubicle each, or a section, and that was known as the stall. And I loved being there with them, and the atmosphere, and they might be eating a bit of hay while they're inside, and they'd be chewing it, and the whole aroma and the steam rising off them on the wet evening. But my mother in particular, if a cow was producing a lot of milk, she might fill a bucket maybe 3/4 of the way. She'd find that weight enough to hold with her knees. She would put that at the back door and get a fresh bucket, an empty bucket, and continue until the milking of that particular cow was done. And of course I couldn't resist the temptation. Here is a bucket of warm milk, lukewarm maybe you'd call it, having come from the udder of the cow. I would be down on my knees and I would swoop up a couple of mouthfuls of the milk. I loved that. And oftentimes I shared that experience with the grey cat at the other side of the bucket. The two of us would be drinking away together, and nobody said anything that was wrong or anything, and it didn't affect my health. I'm still around for 70 years anyway. And the memories of living on the farm. We were very close to nature, as I said, but we were also close to the neighbours. I would really say I was born into a family, but really the shell of that family was the community. We were all part of the same community, and everyone knew everybody else, and you'd visit all the houses and they would all visit us. Maybe not so much on social visits. We did have scurrying. That was more a man's thing than women's or children's. But I was given the job at a young enough age to go to the neighbour's house on a Saturday night. And the reason it was Saturday night was in preparation for Sunday morning. We had just one clock in the house. There was no question of anyone having a second clock. And our clock was not very reliable. It was a wind-up clock resting on the shelf of the dresser. And it wasn't, I think it was going slow. If it was going fast, it wasn't going right anyway. And my job was to go down next door, go in the back door and ask them, what is the right time now? And they would tell me, let's say 20 to 8 in the evening. So I would trot back the 150 yards and in home and say 20 to 8. They would put the clock right, and that would be pretty accurate for the morning after, when farmers everywhere then had to be up earlier, have the cows milked, have the milk ready for the creamery, because the staff in the creamery had to finish early in order to be able to go to Mass and indeed have the day off, because it was Sunday. Sunday was revered as a day of rest then. But I'd say with my parents, they didn't do anything, unless there was very bad weather. They might draw in the hay or something like that if needed attention. But otherwise, no servile work, as they would call it, was done on a Sunday. The milking had to go ahead all right. But there was other neighbours that I used to visit. There was a woman up the road, Mary Mick, and we were very fond of her as kids. And my reason for visiting her was she was the local person who sold paraffin oil for our area. We had no electricity, and a lot of people did not have it initially in my early days in the 50s. And we were probably a little more old-fashioned, because my father was 50 years of age when I was born. And so and my mother wasn't, only a little younger. And our whole culture, I suppose, was coming from an older time. But we had the Tilly lamp. We also had the Storm lamp. I think Storm lantern might be a more proper name for that. We called it the Storm lamp. But we had the Tilly lamp. They were both paraffin oil. There was also a side lamp. And I would take the empty 2-gallon tin for the oil over to Mary McPat's, and she would later fill it. There was no question of I bringing the 2 gallons back. I was far too small. That would be too heavy. But she would fill it. I'd come away back. And I never came with my hands hanging to me, because she always brought, she seemed to have something for us all the time. It might be one biscuit, but that would be such a treat to get a biscuit to eat, or whatever. There would be different treats. She might have a nice tin that held biscuits. There'd be flowers on the cover. She might give us that. She would give us something all the time. And I remember one time she showed me a wooden box, the kind of box that you'd cut the scalloons into and take it out in the field, setting the sprouters in the spring. But it was a 3-sided wooden box, which was a bit unusual. And I thought I'd love that. But again, that was too heavy for me to carry home. But Mary, of course, found a solution to everything. She had raised a large family herself and she was able to solve everything. And there was some bit of a hole in it and she put a bit of twine into it, so I was able to catch the twine and drag the box along the road. Needless to say, that would make a lot of noise, but who cared about a bit of noise? Life was fairly quiet. But Mary didn't know this, and I wasn't thinking of the implication. But that particular day, my father was out in the field. He was opening drills in the Bounds field, which would be the field nearest to Mary's house, furthest away from our own house. And we had a fairly new horse at the time, Paddy. Paddy was the horse that was bought up in Dunboy. And he was of the nervous disposition. I'm afraid Paddy and I there wasn't space for the two of us in the haggart any time. I don't know what it was. My sister could manage him, my father managed him, but my mother and I, we just couldn't. He couldn't cope with us, and it became a bit of a no-go. But my father was working him in the field, and of course once I started in Mary's house, which would be 120 yards away at least, and out of sight, the horse nearly went berserk. My father couldn't control the horse. He was scared of this noise coming at him, and my father had to untackle the horse, much to my father's annoyance. And eventually I came gleefully along the road with my new find, my 3-sided wooden box. Thought, this is marvellous. I can tell you I was not popular at home that day. Father couldn't do any more work with the horse. He had to stop. By the time next day came, I think the horse had calmed down and things, but I never got to do anything with the box after that. It was actually used for the sprouters, which was a springtime job. But I should explain about the gallon of oil first, that Mary would be filling up the road. My father would go screeching later at night, and he was getting on a little bit, and he used to use a bicycle to go cycling. He'd cycle up to maybe Nailes's or Germani's or some house like that, screeching, and he'd cycle back to Mary's. She'd have the gallon of oil out at the end of the footpath. Her house was fairly near the road, and there was a concrete footpath coming out to the public road. And he'd pick up the gallon of oil and, I suppose, walk with the oil and the bike, I'm not sure, put it up in the carrier and walk away. We were gone to bed by the time Father came home, but that was always the way the gallon of oil came from Mary Mix for use on the lamps in our house. And another thing I've memories of, because we had no electricity, when I was older, I used to help my father in the middle of winter. He'd be feeding the cows after the milking, and there was no light, no electricity, so I would hold the storm lamp and I'd walk to the hay shed in front of him. That would give him light and give me light too, because the yard was very uneven. It was natural rock outcrop and it was kind of up and down in places, and he would have the baft of hay then from the shed and bring it along, so I'd walk back to the stall in front of him, and that we'd be back and forth the yard, and it was lovely and peaceful, and nightfall or dark night, and we were out there together and maybe watching the moon, and you'd hear that bird that comes out at night, the Hainey Gower. I don't know what the English name is, but it was something of the goat, but it was a bird. I can't remember the name in English. We'd be listening to things like that, because life was very quiet. There wouldn't be a car passing the road. And the road was not tarred at the time. We referred to the main road, which is now a national secondary route, the N71, we'd refer to that as the tar road. Our road was known as the Board of Works Road because it was built as a post-famine relief scheme a good bit after. I'd say it was 1870 that way, before it was built. But we were very close to nature because everything was more natural then. There was no machinery really. And even implements that were used on the farm, like the pike, the four-pronged pike, the spade for setting the spuds and for digging them, they were actually made locally. The pike, as we'd call it, now something similar is called a long-handled garden fork, but it was a four-pronged pike then. That was made by the blacksmith, and the handles were fashioned, I suppose I'd say, by the farmer. You'd get the timber from perhaps a young ash tree or maybe hazel. Hazel tends to grow straight, and cut off any little, it would be a young tree, and cut off the side branches, smoothen it off a bit, and that's your handle. I have memories of seeing a graffon, which would be maybe a hoe, would be the modern term, but the graffon was an iron tool made by the blacksmith, and I can visualise a handle on that made from a blackthorn, which I think might be a bit unusual. I don't think they were normally blackthorn handles, but I'm not quite certain. Now, of course, they're all made in factories and they're dead straight and everything. We don't even know if they're wooden or are they imitation fabricated wood, I don't know. But so people were much more self-sufficient then. And as kids, we would have helped on the farm, setting the spuds maybe. Never got as far as cutting the scalons. That was a skill kind of left to my mother generally. We'd be helping at the hay, saving the hay, shaking out the hay, making it up in cocks, making it up in bigger cocks, raking to gather all the last sops of hay in. And in the corn, we used to do an awful lot. We might be gone back to school at that stage. That would be later, about August, or maybe September. And when I say corn, what we called corn at the time was oats and barley. It could be wheat. We didn't have wheat at home at that stage. Corn now, I think, is more what we call sweet corn, the vegetable that we eat. It's more an American idea, I think. People do grow it here too, but we call the oats the corn. And I had seen that being harvested with a scythe. It could have also been done with the hook and go log. The go log was a piece of wood, a Y-shaped piece of wood, again got from a tree. So farmers would be very in tune with what kind of branches they could cut off trees and things for purposes like making the go log. The hook was a curved metal blade, and again with a homemade handle. The handle would be probably 6 inches long, and they were often considered a bit dangerous. But if there was bad weather, the oats or the barley would be lodged, stretched on the ground, and the machine that was available then was the reaper and binder. That wouldn't be able to get it on a flat, onto its horizontal, so it would be cut with a scythe. A piece of straw would be separated and made into like a rope, and that would tie a bundle of the corn. So that's a sheaf. They would be stood together making a stook. Then the stokes would be taken home and put into a big stack. And then the day of the machine, as my father used to call it, or the day of the thrashing, would arrive. And that was a big day. I suppose it was culmination of harvest, in a way. And in our case, my sister and I, we would divide the area between us. She would call to so many houses, I would call to so many more. We'd have half each, telling them that the machine is coming. We wouldn't know what hour. It will be there later, but 'tis going to Sweeney's first and 'tis coming to us then, or something like that. That's how they'd know when it would be, because we didn't have telephones, or we didn't have anything like that to say, come along in 10 minutes or whatever. Even though the machine was doing the threshing, you needed maybe 8, 10, 12 helping hands, maybe 8 or 10. Some to feed the machine with the crop from the top of the stack, one at least to handle the bags at the outlet, someone else, maybe 2 more to pipe the straw up on a reek, 2 more up on the straw reek, levelling it and put it in place. So yeah, you've about 8 people there, and there might be relief. Maybe someone would come late and someone else would want to go early and that. And of course then the porter would be distributed afterwards, and they'd have great talk and tea, the big feed of tea and bread and whatnot. A couple of pairs of bread would be bought for that, and the bottles of stout, as they were called. That was a lovely day. And digging the potatoes was sometimes done by mehel, which is a gathering of people again, and getting the neighbours in to pick the spuds or dig them or whatever. We didn't have mehel really in our house, but a lot of people would have. And again, another celebration. And sometimes those things would go on into the morning, the celebrations would. But a lot of other things in the school too, like the going to school was an experience in itself. In our case, we went the shortcut to school, walking a piece of the road, in a laneway to a farmyard, through the farmyard, up the fields, over the bounce ditch, another field or two, into another second farmyard, down a lane to the Inchiclock school. We didn't see it as difficult or anything like that. We used to change our shoes, I think, in the hay shed or the cow shed car house of the second farmyard, because we didn't need wellies then. But I think we had leather boots in the beginning, and they were shop bought. Shoes that my father made were always made by the shoemaker. And of course all our clothes as kids were made by my mother. She knitted the jumpers, she made the skirts and the dresses and all that. All the time. And I know when I started school, I got the second-hand school bag. My mother had made it. It was kind of gabardine or calico, I don't know, a strong navy cloth. It was called the satchel, and it had one strap going crossways over the shoulder, probably closed by a button, I can't quite remember. But that served me for a number of years, going to school. We'd take a bottle of milk. It was dreadful altogether if a person had water going to school. That was frowned upon, because it's really giving the impression that you can't afford the milk. So we'd had a bottle of milk. But in the winter time we took cocoa, and that would be warmed in front of the open fire, and we'd drink it then. And if there was any crust of bread that we didn't feel like eating, we threw it into the fire. So you can imagine the aroma in the classroom with several crusts of bread burning away nicely as well. I think the teacher lit the fire in the morning. That never seemed to be a big feature. So that was there. But I should say, before we went to school, we got a set of instructions on how to go to school. And it wasn't so much which field to go into and that. It was, you'll be encountering gates. We were going in private property, of course. If the gate is closed, this was really the important rule of the day. If the gate is closed, you shut the gate after you. And if the gate is opened, you leave it open after you. And if the gate is half opened, you leave it half opened after you. That was really important. I don't know why half opened. It might be to let out the calves and not the cow, or something like that. I don't know. There was no electricity in the school, but that made no difference to us because we had no electricity at home. There was no water. We didn't have drinking water in school, but we weren't used to drinking water anyway. There was a dry toilet. That was the terror. But in our case, I can only speak for the girls' toilet. It was dry technically, but the floor was always wet because we didn't bother going much beyond the door, and we used the floor, if you know what I mean. So that kind of, unless you were there early in the morning, that was wet, so you'd want to watch where you're standing. But on a very hot summer's day, we'd be sent, the teacher would give us a metal bucket, maybe 2 pupils, and go to the nearest house, O'Mahony's, for a bucket of water so that we could fill our bottles. Having drank what we had at lunchtime, we could fill them again and drink half bottle of water. And the elderly woman there would pump the water. They had a hand pump inside in the scullery and fill the bucket with that. And there was beautiful stone buildings in that farmyard as well. Of course, that was part of what was known as Inchiclough School, which was once owned by, I think it was Simon White, I'm not sure, one of the Hamilton White, one of the White family that lived on Whiddy Island and lived later then in Bantry House and were the landlords and that. And Inchiclough School was actually the stables for the horses of that extended family, and it was converted into a school. I'm not sure when. It closed some 6 or 10 years ago there, and unfortunately it's a pity because I think it's gone into private ownership now, but it's no longer a school anyway. So I remember one time coming home from school. I was on my own, which was a little bit unusual. I nearly always had someone with me. But I was coming along a field, and we'd go along a good ways, and we had a point on the bounds ditch where we would cross into the next farm. So I was sauntering along at my ease. There was cattle further on, but I wasn't taking any great notice. And next thing, I was probably away in a world of my own, and I could hear this voice, kind of a whisper, but out loud nevertheless, "Come back, come back, come back." So I responded, I came back. There was a man's voice, and I think I couldn't see him with the bushes. He said, "You can cross here, I'll help you, come up here." So I got a helping hand, came over the ditch at a different place. I recognised the man. He was Humphrey Glanny. Fair play to him. When he had me on his side of the fence, we walked away down to the house, and he told me, "There's a bull over there with the cows." And I think it didn't mean much to me at the time. I thought, what's all the fuss? I hadn't realised that a bull could be dangerous. And he had a little gift of a small handball for me as well. That was the lovely thing about these older people. They always seemed to pick up a gift. It wasn't something got in the shop, it was, just something it meant an awful lot. And believe it or not, I still have it. But I don't know what happened in subsequent days with the bull. Maybe he was moved again. But that's an indication of the culture that Humphrey Glanny was so concerned about us as neighbours' children, and maybe relatives as well. He took the time to walk up to his bounds with the next townland, next farmer, and wait for me and bring me safely home despite the bull in the field. People did look out for each other. People did care much more about one another. As I said, I was born into a family, parents, sister and myself, but also into a community, and we were very close together. I think that is dying now, but I could go on and on, about thinning turnips in the summer and that, but they were the different activities that we did. So I'll leave my young days at that. We had stories about the times of the Troubles as well. Not a lot, but I remember one story before I could finish. My father used to talk about Minnie Pats. She was a woman who lived up the road. And on the 8th of December, and I think this was during the Civil War, it was on a church holiday. She was walking to Mass, as people did, normal enough. But dear oh dear, she had left home, she had come near our place, and she found that there was shots being fired all around her, and she was petrified. So she ran up to our house, and they tried to get her to sit at the kitchen table and have a cup of tea there, as you would with any neighbour who'd come in. No, she was too scared. She stood practically inside in the open fireplace because she was out of view. She was convinced she was out of view of the one window that was there. She was convinced they were going to come outside the window and they were going to shoot her from outside. And she certainly was in panic. And she stayed there for a number of hours. Eventually the shooting died down. The staters, as they were called, the Free Staters, were around on that particular day, I think. And I think my father walked home with her because she was afraid to go alone, but everything was quiet. And when he was coming back, he thought, gosh, do you know, I've no tobacco. He used to smoke a pipe. And he saw a neighbour, Pack, down at his own place there in the field. So my father was on the road. He hopped up on the ditch, called Pack, have you any bit of tobacco? And he just looked down. I never heard the story about the tobacco, whether he got it or not. That was never finished, that story. My father looked down on the ground, on the field, underneath him, and there lay the body of a young man who had been shot dead that morning. That's how life was in those days. He was obviously involved with the troops in some way, and I'm afraid, I think he was only late teens or some age like that, a man from Madrigal. But that was kind of par for the course then. And, you know, when we think of our parents who lived through times like that and would have known people, and my father knew close cousins and that who were murdered, it kind of colours the culture and the way of life and the way of thinking of these people. And that is something we don't hear of now. We don't want to hear it, I suppose. We're now celebrating centenaries of these events, or marking them at least, commemorating them maybe more than. There isn't a lot to celebrate in people being murdered, surely. But life has changed, culture has changed an awful lot. And that's my offering for the moment. So I'll leave it at that.
Thanks, Angela.